So I have a very different take on what's been going on at the Fed and between the White House and the Fed and um, just everything that, has been going on really the last couple of years, if not the last 20, 30, 40 years of Fed policy. I have a very different take from the standpoint that I look at this Fed lowering the rates. Is it some capitulation to Trump because of the revised job numbers? I mean, clearly there were issues with the data that was being used to justify not cutting rates before. Is it a we'll cut the rates just to shut you up? Is it actual influence by the White House? There's a lot of back and forth about all that, and all of that conversation is valid from the standpoint that, well, there was something that the president talked about profusely, and then after lots of resistance, the Fed seemed to do what he wanted. And I know for some it's a victory, or for some it's a painful admission, or whatever you want to call it. But I look at this from a completely different angle. Um, my angle is, does it matter if you cut rates slightly? How does that impact the average person? Because the average person at this moment, obviously I fully understand. I'll say this. I fully understand that if you're buying a house and you're not paying for it outright, rates matter because the Fed sets a rate and that rate will help determine the rates downstream. I get that. Okay? It's the cost of money, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, the cost of money. So when you're borrowing money, this has an impact. So yeah, if you're buying a house or if you're, making any kind of large purchase, or if you're, investing and you're speculating and stuff, I totally get it. This is important. When you transact a loan, like in syndicated loan business, and you have $200 million in a facility, or you have $1 billion or something, the rate that money is costing the borrower matters. The rates that are set for the lenders, it matters. I understand that, and it is important. But my angle is, the most important thing to the average person is not just the rate, and it's not even the rate. It's who owns the money, and just let that sink in. Who owns the money? So during this process where Trump is fighting with the Fed, what I took away from it was not just the argument itself about him, wanting to have a rate cut and the Fed resisting that rate cut and a lot of back and forth over that. My issue was when he went to fire somebody from the Fed, and it was a question of, can you even do that? Well, the reason it was questionable because it was saying, well, the Fed's an independent agency. Okay, so the Federal Reserve is an independent agency. It's not actually part of the federal government. Well, it's part of the federal government, but it's an independent agency, and the president can't just fire and hire people as he wants. Okay, so he can appoint a Fed chairman, but he can't fire anybody at the Fed. Again, I'm going along with their logic, with the logic of the media and the logic and the definitions that are told to us by the people who work in the government. Okay, so that's what you say. The Constitution says that the President of the United States has the power as the chief executive. Remember, George Washington said he didn't want to be a king. He could have been king, and we would have had a monarchy like the English have, quote unquote. Of course, it's really run by London City banks. We'll get to that. But yeah, we don't have a monarchy. We have a president who's a chief executive. Just like a chief executive, he's the manager essentially of the government. He's the executive branch, business office manager, basically, right? And he has the power to hire and fire people of the branches of government that are not already designated to their roles by the Constitution. So this is actually very important. The Constitution says he can't fire a senator. He can't fire a governor of a state. He can't fire a congressman. He can't do that. Okay? He has no power to do that. So he can call for, like, let's say he doesn't like Ilhan Oman, right? For example, he doesn't like her. He's not alone, but he doesn't like her. He doesn't have the power to remove her from office. He doesn't have the power to fire her just because he's president. Okay? They can disagree. She's part of a representative government that separates that power of her removal from the president. But the Federal Reserve is not designated by the Constitution as a separate entity that the president has no power over. And here's the thing. Number one, the Federal Reserve isn't designated by the Constitution at all. Okay, it was they ratified in order to to create the current Federal Reserve. There were two central banks prior to the Fed. Both of them were terminated. One was terminated by Thomas Jefferson, and the other was terminated by Andrew Jackson. And we'll get into at some point why these two figures, and I can just tell you, I believe the reason these two figures have come out so poorly in history is because their support for the termination of central banks angered those who wanted the central banks. So historically, Thomas Jefferson is constantly demonized because of slavery, as if he's the only person who had slaves or the only person who had anything to do with that. And there are many people involved in slavery who are let off scot-free or even treated like heroes. And then Andrew Jackson, all you ever hear about with him is the Trail of Tears. Well, there were many trails of tears. Many Americans are living on Trail of Tears right now, but there were many trails of tears. And there were also trails of tears that were done by the people who he committed atrocities against. And I'm not defending some of his actions, but there's other points about Andrew Jackson that need to be mentioned. Number one, he's a war hero. Number two, I don't see anybody giving up the land that he conquered for the United States. And number three, he got rid of a central bank. The third thing is the reason why he's hated. Okay. So getting back to it, the president doesn't have the authority, according to the government and the media. He can't fire people at the Fed. He has no right to do that. Well, according to the Constitution, he does have the right to do that unless the Fed is part of Congress or the Supreme Court, because there are in the Constitution it designates the things that the president can't do, or the entities that the president does not have power over, because those are either proposed through Congress or proposed by the people through a voting system. So again, he can nominate a Supreme Court justice, but he can't just walk in and fire one. And they have to be secured. Whereas other parts of his administration do not have to be. Like the assistant, White House director doesn't have to be confirmed by Congress. So what struck me about the situation with the Fed versus Trump in this term, what are we? We're in September, so he's been president for about 8 months, 7.5 months. So yeah, we're almost at 8 months of his presidency. Feels like 10 years, but it's and that's not a knock. I'm just saying it's because of the intensity of the reporting. But 7.5 months in, almost 8 months in, and he's been president and he's been battling with the Fed. But the problem I have is if he's battling with the Fed over firing somebody, and the reason is that he's supposedly not allowed, but the Constitution says that he is, then what does that mean? That means that the Fed isn't part of the federal government. It's not a fully integrated part of the government. Well, if the Fed isn't a fully integrated part of the government, what does that mean for the average person? It means that the dollars that are in your pocket, the dollars that this Fed chairman is saying that he's going to cut the rates on the dollar, he's going to cut the rate by a quarter of a point. Okay. That means that it's not owned by the citizens, it's not owned by the government. So the money is owned by who? It's owned by private bank. So if the United States doesn't own its own money, then that speaks to a larger problem, because that means that the United States citizens carry the load of the debt, but they don't actually own the currency. So the benefactors of the interest on the debt, the benefactors of the borrowing, is not the citizens itself. So let me propose to you a different world, a different scenario. So you have, going back before the Fed, and this is even during the Civil War and before that. So you have a multitude of private banks, and these private banks can issue, or they house gold and silver, and they could issue notes for the reserves that they have. And the people can, obviously, you can barter and trade, but for the most part, you can then trade your notes for products. And if you have, let's say, you don't want to trade your cow for, I don't know, sheepskin or wood or a finished product like a chair or a bed or something like that or a wheel, and you want to use your notes. Well, the notes have power because they represent what is sitting in reserve. But here's the other part of it. If you were to borrow from the bank, let's say you just go to a bank it's in your town, and you say, I need to borrow like 100 notes because I need to build something. The benefactors of the borrowing are the people, the local people who have their money in that bank, who have their gold, their silver, etc., in that bank, their coins in that bank. The reason why is because they own the notes that are being lent to you as you go out into the economy and attempt to expand the economy through economic activity. Because when you pay back the bank with a percentage of interest, whatever that bank holds, they analyze what it is that you want the money for, and they set the framework for what that money will cost you, because there has to be a cost to borrowing the money, because they can only lend out a percentage of what they have in reserve. This is the whole point of fractional reserve banking. So they lend you some money, right? They give you notes. They say this is worth 100 gold coins or silver coins or whatever, and you spend that on building a store or a factory or building a experimental wheel that you're going to sell or whatever it is that you do that they analyze and approve. The interest on the money goes back to the bank. The people that have the money in the bank, they will benefit from the money in the bank expanding, because the bank itself will pay interest to the lenders, who are the bank depositors, for putting the money in the bank, which allows them to then invest. So everybody wins in that scenario. The person who develops economically, meaning like the person who borrows the money, they win. The bank wins because they get a share, because they did the work of holding the money, analyzing the investment, and lending the money. They get a share of the interest on that. And then the shareholders, meaning the depositors, they get they get they get a percentage. They get something back. Hey, you put $10 in our bank. Well, we had a good year. So just so you know, you now have $10.50 or $11. And you could say, well, isn't that similar to what happens now? It is. When you put money in your bank, and that bank pays you out a yield for what you house. It's a low yield for checking, it's a higher yield for savings. Why? Because in theory, your checking is what you're using constantly to pay for goods and services, and your savings is parked. Okay, so the Federal Reserve is not that. The Federal Reserve is not that, because the Federal Reserve is not an American publicly owned bank. It's a private bank. So they are issuing currency to the government. The government is wasting money on everything under the sun, completely irrational, irresponsible spending. They've been doing it for ever since Bretton Woods. The federal government's been completely out of control. And they're spending all this money, And then they turn around and they want to borrow more. So they either borrow it from foreign countries or they borrow it from the Fed. And the Fed is then taking on and giving out these Federal Reserve notes, because that's what your dollar says. It says Federal Reserve note, and they own that money. But that money isn't owned by the public. So you're not benefiting from the government paying interest back to the Fed. Nobody is. You just own the debt. The politicians, Chuck Schumer's not paying the interest. Chuck Schumer has enough money that he could stay ahead of the increased cost of living. Same thing with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Same thing with Mitch McConnell. Same thing with every politician. They stay ahead of the curve. They borrow more money. They make money off of that because they have all kinds of investments and kickbacks and all that. But you, the citizen, you suffer because your currency is worth less and less and less. Every time money is borrowed, you then have money in your pocket that's worth less because all the money in your pocket is not a local bank's dollar. It's all Federal Reserve notes. There are no competing currencies in this country. So you have a dollar in your pocket that's worth less because every time the Fed, and this is this rate cutting is nominal at best because, okay, they cut the rate. So what does that mean? We're going to borrow more at a cheaper rate? That's going to hurt the citizens. The citizens are holding $36 trillion in debt. So the increase in debt will be less only because the rate is slightly less. Okay, thank you. But that doesn't eliminate the debt we already have. And the citizen isn't getting a kickback from the interest payment because the citizen only owns the debt. The citizen doesn't own the money in the bank. That's not your money. It's a private bank's money only because they created it from thin air. So this is to me, this is almost like this battle between Trump and the Fed has illuminated again the relationship that the central bank of this country has with its people. And that is, it is not part of it. And that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing in China. It's not the same thing in Russia. These are actual government banks. If you look at the Reichstag Bank in Germany in the 1930s, when in 1939, when the head of the Reichstag Bank said to the German government, we don't want to lend any more money for any programs, but we're happy to work with you in the future. What happened? The Hitler removed that person. And as soon as he did that, that was the beginning of the end for Germany with the rest of the world because the Western banks all said, oh, this is unacceptable. So they had no problem with anything that was happening in Germany until the head of the Reichstag Bank was removed in 1939. That's why it's not a coincidence. It's not about just Poland. Oh, they invaded Poland. Well, the Soviets invaded Poland too. And we didn't go to war with them. And the British didn't want to go to war with the Soviets because the British are already dominated by the banks and by former Marxists who had left in favor of Trotsky. So, eventually they hated the Soviet Union, but they hated the Germans more because they hated the Nazis, because the Nazis were a bigger enemy to them in the beginning than what the Soviets were. It gets very convoluted, and that's a totally different subject. But the point is that the Reichstag Bank was owned by the German government. The Chinese central bank is owned by China. Our central bank isn't owned by us. The European central bank isn't owned by Europe. The British central bank, London City banks, they're not owned. It's not owned by the people. The Bank of International Settlements in in Basel, Switzerland, is not owned by the people of Switzerland, and it's definitely not owned by the citizens of the United States. But here's a funny fact. The Central Bank of the United States is a part owner of that bank, along with all the other Western central banks. That's where all their deposits are going. So you're helping to enrich the central banks of the Western banking system, but you are not benefiting at all. But in the 1800s and that style of banking, the thousands of different independent banks that existed, when your local money went into a local bank and they gave you a note for that, that benefited the people. And this system, and trust me, the system we have now worked better a long time ago. During Bretton Woods, it worked. It worked, I should say, it worked better than it does now. But it was already being corrupted because the greedy politicians were already siphoning cash that they weren't supposed to away from Bretton Woods, and the French were the first to call it out and say, "Hey, where's our gold? What, you guys are spending a lot of money and printing a lot of money, and we don't think you're keeping a balance that matches the amount of deposits that we put into your reserve." They questioned it. Now, though some of those questions, were alleviated for, the exchange of Vietnam, where we went in and picked up where the French left off. But then when Nixon ended Bretton Woods, then it became even worse because basically then the Fed, I mean, they could print as much money as they wanted technically because we weren't tying our dollar to gold and silver. We were tying it to nothing. And it was, informally tied and tethered to petro and to oil. But the petrodollar thing is not technically, it's an unofficial arrangement, and it's already come undone. So the point is here, if you have this back and forth about the Fed, to me the real issue is not that the Fed is cutting rates nominally or raising rates. It is important. But the real issue is who owns the money. If you don't own the money, if you don't own it as a country, then you're off the bat. You're not in a position of strength. Not owning our own currency is the absolute original problem that our currency has in its relationship with its citizens.